Okay, so this is problem number 3 for the bonus problems for exam 2. And what the question is asking us is copper reacts with sulfuric acid according to the following equation. So we see we get 2 moles of sulfuric acid plus 1 mole of copper. And when we react that together, we get a reaction producing products of 1 mole of copper sulfate plus 2 moles of water plus 1 mole of sulfur dioxide. So the question is being asked, how many grams of the excess reagent is left over in this reaction if we have 14.2 grams of copper react with 19.0 grams of sulfuric acid? So the first thing we want to do before we do any calculations major that will require this problem, let's go ahead and first determine molar masses. So we can use our periodic table, and we'll first determine molar mass of copper. I'm just going to do MM for molar mass. So for molar mass of copper, we can clearly see that's a straight, easy one that just goes right off the table. We can see that that's going to become 63.55 grams. And then likewise, if we check the molar mass for sulfuric acid, on the other hand, this one, since we've got multiple elements within the compound, we can go ahead and do each individual part. So we see that we have 2 hydrogens. So that's going to be 2 times the atomic weight of 1.008 plus the sulfur element. There's only 1, so we're going to have 1 sulfur atom. That's going to be 32.06. And then lastly, we've got 4 oxygen atoms. So that's going to be 4 times 16. Now, when we add all this up and calculate it, get the correct amount of sig figs, we're going to get a value of 98.08 grams. So these here are going to be our 2 molar masses for our reactants. Now let's go ahead and check. So this was step 1. Now let's go ahead and check step 2, which is going to determine the limiting reactions. So what we can do here first is we can test both the copper individually, and then we can test the sulfuric acid to determine which of these 2 is going to have a limiting amount to use for the reaction. So let's check for the limiting reaction. So let's start with copper. So we know we're given 14.2 grams of copper. So we can first plug that in, 14.2 grams of copper. And we want to convert this grams into moles. So in doing so, we can say that 14.2 grams of copper multiplied by 1 mole of copper. Now remember, we determined the molar mass. This is why we did this. So the molar mass was 63.55 grams of copper. And as you can see, the copper grams are going to cancel each other out. And then we're also going to multiply by this reaction. We know that 1 mole of this reaction, if we look at the balanced equation, 1 mole is only going to require 1 copper mole. So that's all we need to put here. So as you can see, I'm going to be able to cancel out my grams of copper, my moles of copper, and I'm just left with a value for moles and mole reaction. So when you calculate all this together, I went on ahead and did a pre-calculation prior to the video starting. After my rounding, I get 0.223 moles for the reaction. Okay, so now let's go ahead and check the sulfuric acid. So for the sulfuric acid, we are given 19 grams to work with. So 19 grams of sulfuric acid. And we're going to do the same thing we just did for the copper. We're going to, right on the top, 1 mole of sulfuric acid. And again, this is why we determined the molar mass. So we're going to put ourselves with the molar mass here, which we determined that to be 98.08 grams. And notice I'm keeping all of my units together so then we can remember what's going to be canceled out. And then lastly, on the last section, we know that 1 mole of reaction. Now we need to look at this. It's not going to be the same as copper here. Now copper in this reaction only required 1 mole. However, for sulfuric acid to get this mole reaction to work, or to get this reaction to properly work, we need to have 2 moles of the sulfuric acid. So we can't just put in 1, we actually need to plug in 2. And again, we can see that our our units are going to cancel, and I forgot to put mole right here. So the moles are going to go away, and we're just left with the mole reaction. And again, I pre-calculated this prior to the video. What I get here is 0.194 moles of reaction. So now we look at these two numbers and we determine which of the two is going to be the limiting reagent. The smaller value is going to be the limiting reagent. Therefore, since 0.194 is less than 0.223, we can assume that, sulfuric acid is going to be our limiting reagent. So I'm just going to put on the side here that the limiting reagent is going to be the H2SO4. So I'm going to erase this little bit to save some space, but this is what we know so far. We have a limiting reagent of sulfuric acid. So we know that our copper is going to be a excess reagent, which is what we'll determine later after we solve a few more things. So now I'm going to erase this information, and then we're going to move on to the next step, which is going to ask for how many grams are produced of this reaction. So then we can use that to determine what was calculated for, well, I guess how many grams of copper was used, then we can calculate what was left over. So just for room, I'm going to erase this stuff as well. Now, so moving forward, so again, I've got this information written down. So now we can go ahead and say that since we have our limiting reagent with sulfuric acid, we're going to go ahead and use all 19 grams. And what we want to do is we want to convert this into moles of sulfuric acid. Then we want to convert those moles of sulfuric acid to, so basically if we do this little chart here, we want to go from this to moles of sulfuric acid. Then we're going to convert that to moles of copper. And then we're going to convert the moles of copper to grams of copper. So this is what our plan is. So if we go ahead and start calculating, we're going to see that we have 1 mole of sulfuric acid. And again, we calculated molar mass already. We're going to use the same value, 98.08 grams. Okay, and then the next thing we want to do is we want to convert this mole into copper moles. So for every, again, we look at the reaction. So for every 1 mole of copper, we require 2 moles of sulfuric acid. So we're going to have 1 mole of copper on the top, and we're going to have 2 moles of sulfuric acid on the bottom. So we need to make sure that we keep the right values with those. And lastly, let's go ahead and convert the moles of copper into grams. So we know that 63.55 grams of copper is equivalent to 1 mole of copper. And now we can again cancel out terms that are alike, units that are the same. And when we calculate this, we're going to get a value, after we round off, we're going to get a value of 6.16 grams of copper used in this reaction. Okay, so we use 6.16 grams of copper. Now, this is not the final answer. The final answer is asking what is left over of copper. So we say that we were started with the copper that was started. Let me reiterate that. Let's call that copper provided. Copper provided was equal to 14.2 grams. Copper used was equal to 6.16 grams. So copper left over, I can just do the difference of these two. So I can say copper left over is the copper provided subtracted minus the copper used, and that's going to tell me what's left over. So I can just say that copper left over is equal to 14.2 grams subtracted by 6.16 grams that was used, and we're going to get a final value of 8.04 grams of copper left over. And this right here is the final answer, because again, it's asking us what was the excess reagent left over. Well, our excess reagent was copper, and we've determined that the leftover amount of it was in terms of grams is going to be 8.04 grams. So this right here is going to be the final answer.